Hello everyone, in this recording we'll be discussing ggplot2. This is my very favorite R package, so you're in for a treat. The GG in ggplot2 stands for Grammar of Graphics. So what is grammar doing in a data visualization class? Let's step back. In ordinary grammar, it's different kinds of rules for combining words into sentences. So you can think of it as we start with very basic units, but then we can compose them together in a complicated way to get very expressive ideas. The idea of the grammar of graphics is that the same point applies to visualization. Instead of having things like point-and-click interfaces where you're given a fixed menu of kinds of visualizations you should make, the grammar of graphics says, start with these basic layers, these basic visual components, things like points and text and scales, and then compose them together in a way that allows you to express yourself in visualizations that no one could have planned in advance. That is the fundamental idea of ggplot2. So we'll be getting tons and tons of practice with this package over the class. Let's just make our very first kind of basic visualization. It's going to be this kind of labeled scatter plot showing population versus total number of murders. So it's a very morbid note to start a class on, but it was the data set in the reading, so we're going to do it. Each point is a state. You can have their population. What's kind of interesting, you can see things like, Iowa and Oregon have a lot less than this line, and the line is actually the national rate. So if every state had exactly the same as the national rate number of murders, it would be on the line. The ones that are very far above the lines, like Louisiana, DC, these have much higher than the national rate of murders. Okay, we'll see the code to make this plot in a minute. But then first, let's review the basic idea about how the syntax is structured. So in every plot you make with ggplot, you're going to have to think about three things. You're going to have to think about the data that underlies it. You're going to have to think about the geometry, which in this context means the visual marks that appear in the plot. And you're going to have to think about the aesthetic mapping. So it's a fancy word for saying whatever is in the abstract data frame is going to have to get linked to the physical marks in the geometry. So when we think about data in ggplot, we want to make sure that every row corresponds to one mark. Right? So a mark, in this case, each of these circles, you want to make sure each of those circles is going to get its own row. So in this case, it makes sense. Every state should have its own row. All the properties that we're going to be encoding, they have to be stored as column names. This seems all very obvious, but you'd be surprised by the number of times you get a data set out in the wild and it's not structured in this very natural way. I wouldn't be surprised to see this kind of data formatted like this if I downloaded it from some government website. Right, so here it's storing all the states as column names, right, and it's broken this kind of tidiness. Tidiness meaning each point, each sample belong to one row. So actually a lot of trouble when you actually make a data visualization isn't going to be in figuring out the commands to make the visualization. It's going to be in pre-processing the data so that it's in a format where it's easy to make the visualization. Right, pre-processing it so that each visual mark is a row of the data set. That's going to be an important thing to do. Okay, that was data. Geometry. So geometry, these are the graphical marks. You can think about them totally independent of any data. Right? So it could be points, lines, tiles. Just to illustrate, here is how you can make visual marks. You can make these geometries in ggplot without using any data. Right? So I've added a point layer, and I've composed it with a text layer. I've just given them points at the origin. So it's not using anything from the murders dataset at all, right? And it's just drawn tests, and it's drawn an empty slate. Okay, that's the geometry. They're physical marks on the screen. They don't necessarily have to encode any data. If we want to encode data, we can add in this aesthetic mapping. So in this case, the population, state population, that's the x-axis, number of murders, abstract information, but we're going to encode it by the physical y location. And region, again, abstract, but we're going to label it using color. How do you do that in ggplot? You use this AES, it stands for aesthetic encoding, and you pass it into the layer where you want to encode properties of these geometries using these encodings. It's making the link between the data and the properties of these points. So notice we didn't even have to refer to the columns of the murders frame. It knows just by typing in population and total that you mean population within the murders data frame. And it's made exactly kind of like a prototype of the plot that we had originally. Maybe the most noticeable difference is that there was a difference in the scales for the x and y axis, right? So in the original plot, everything is actually on a log scale. It's like 10, 100, 1,000 murders. So how can we get that sort of rescaling? In ggplot, there are commands called these kind of scale commands. And what this scale x log 10 is doing is it's taking the x-axis scale and it's representing it on a log. Right? So now population is multiplicative rather than just additive. It's not obvious, but there are many kinds of scales like this. So here I'm manually changing the scale for the color. Right? So instead of just default encoding certain regions with certain colors, I'm using these specific hex colors to represent the region. I just picked them out of some color palette. Okay, so another difference between what we had originally shown and this plot is this plot doesn't actually have the names of the states. You cannot tell just from this plot which states have the higher murder rates or the lower murder rates. It only tells you the overall relationship and the regions which have higher or lower murders. To do that, we're going to add a new layer. And so this is like adding words. So here I've added geom_text. I've given it the same kind of encoding as before, except I've added this label encoding. What label is doing, it's saying look into the column called ABB, abbreviation, and use that as a label for your geom_text. It's just a property of the text. I've given it some nudge command. You can try running it without it. I'll break the suspense. If you hadn't had the nudge command, it would be just exactly overlapping the point. Okay, so notice there's a lot of redundancy between this code. So specifically, this population and total is showing up in both of the layers. Whenever you have that much redundancy, it's good to try to export them to the high-level aesthetic encoding, the one that appears before all the layers are called. If you have an AES within ggplot, it's going to apply that encoding to every single following layer, unless it's explicitly overwritten. So here, I put population and total here. It makes the code a lot more concise, a lot more readable. Now the only things that appear in the aesthetic encodings for the other layers are those that are unique for that layer. Okay, so this is already a lot better than the original plot, but we can improve on it even further, right? What are some of the issues with this plot? We were thinking very critically. What's the difference between a plot that you see in the New York Times and what you're looking at right now? Something like the New York Times would never have labels that are overlapping like this. That's kind of one very novice kind of mistake to make. It would be useful to have a reference line for the national rate. So here we can kind of guess the national rate, but it's not anything precise. The labels here, these labels, like what does total even mean? Total of what? Yeah, and then the colors, I think you could always customize the colors. So each of those little changes, we have some little change in the code. So let's walk through that. So the first one I mentioned is the labels are overlapping. We can fix this by using the ggRepel command, or the ggRepel package. So notice now there's little arrows that are pointing to points. So this is keeping them from overlapping. The way I accomplish this is instead of using geom_text, I'm using geom_text_repel. One of the other ideas was to try encoding the national rate. So in this block here, I've computed the national murder rate, and I've created a new layer, this new mark, this AB line mark. And what it's encoding is just the national rate. Okay. Some of the other issues, the legends and the label names were not really that useful. I can customize that by using this labs command. So whatever I give it for X and Y, those are going to now appear as the X and Y labels. And I've customized the color. Here is just some color brewer palette. It's one of the many kinds of color palettes that are available in ggplot. I've also removed the gray background by using this theme minimal. Okay, it's still not New York Times quality, but it's a lot more polished than what we started with. So hopefully this was a useful introduction to how you start composing layers in ggplot. We'll see many more kinds of encodings, many more kinds of marks throughout this class.